This Rework Mercy conversation is possibly the most controversial issue I've ever seen in the Overwatch community over the past 3 years, so I think it merits further follow-up and a bigger investigation into what both sides think about this issue. Today we're taking a bit more of a deeper dive into the competitive implications and specifically the pro community. I got a chance to get in a call with Dream, who is an analyst/coach for British Hurricanes, the EU contenders team. We'll leave Dream's Twitter link in the description. You can go hit him a follow and see what he'll be up to in the future. The quick synopsis of the following argument, or the TLDW version of this video, is many in the pro community believe that Mercy would enable Goats Comp even better than it would outside of it. We'll let him try to speak his piece, but just to get into a little bit of numbers, something that didn't get mentioned in the interview that I want to make sure that I say now, whenever you even dream about substituting Zenyatta for Mercy, you have to remember that Zenyatta puts out healing, puts out Discord Orb, and his own almost DPS-esque damage source with his own orbs, all at the same time, whereas Mercy only holds a beam on one target. So for Dream's point of view, you'll still be able to play around your cooldowns and damage amp your Zarya to still get kills, combining with Bash and everything else. But at least how I'm looking at the math of this, if you discord a target and have 2 to 3 things attack it at once, well, that's basically Mercy's Valkyrie ultimate. So trading out Zenyatta's Discord Orb for Mercy's mid-fight would equal losing the effective damage of a Valkyrie ult, which we all know isn't very good, but that's how good Discord is. Not to mention, Zen also is fragging and hitting headshots in his own right while this is all going on. Playing that way to sustain with Mercy, in my opinion, you're just sustaining to eventually die. You have no offense at that point. But we'll see which arguments you're convinced by. Let us know in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. I want to sort of lay down the groundwork of where my ideas are resting in the meta, and specifically the fact that there's multiple things at play here. So there's, of course, your world, which is all wrapped up into the pro side of things, but there's also the ranked environment and multiple things that we can probably go down in different directions. So there's the, of course, issue with 3-3 itself, and maybe where we think that should go and the solutions that you might have that are different than mine. But also, the stem of this does come from the character Mercy just being not very fun to play at base. It comes from the idea that we want her to be more impactful in some way, to do something. My reasons for it, of course, is because I believe that she's a character that enables damage more than she does tanks, and because of that, if she had either a defensive ult or res back or some other mix of reworks, that it would ultimately benefit a 2-2-2 playstyle more than a tank playstyle and be stronger to try to get a bit more diversity into the meta. Do you want to tackle Mercy first, and then maybe we can get into any of the other things with Goats Comp later?
Of course. So obviously, just looking at Mercy's history in Overwatch and like the amount of changes she's gone through and how controversial a character she is, it'd be completely unfair to say that she hasn't almost always been in a weird spot throughout like the history of Overwatch, right? She's always either really good or really bad, and people are always wanting her to be fixed. And I think there's some fundamental issues there, and I think reworking or making significant changes to the hero is not a bad idea. But I think that her core identity of like pocketing a hero and being attached to like the only way that she's going to be viable in that niche without being oppressive and in every game is if it's a meta where those carry champions or carry heroes are good, but not broken, right? So I would argue that one of the big reasons that she was so popular for a long period in Overwatch League was not just her relative strength in herself, but the fact that she had the carry options of like a Widow or a Zen to boost, and the Zen would play, you know, like a very damage-centric carry role. And I think that as long as that is her core identity, irregardless of the ultimate, I think she's going to maintain these issues, maintain this inability to feel like in a good spot.
Part of the issue is that because there's not really plays for her to make, I mean, maybe she sneaks in and get a res nowadays, but usually there's almost no play for her to make other than hide behind her carry, whereas in other metas, she had a lot more decision-making and more interactive gameplay, and I think that's where, at least just from the personal perspective of the player, that could get increased. But I also think it can make an impact in the meta where I personally, at least, liked seeing hyper carries get enabled in that era. And that was one of the major upsides to Mercy being incredibly strong, where you got to see Pine play McCree or Carpe play Widow. And I wonder, is it more so that players don't want to see Mercy come back, or are we just against hyper carry DPS being enabled? I'm kind of unsure even where you stand on any of this, because I've received so much different feedback that people think Mercy would enable tank comps even more rather than damage. So, or do you just think damage has no place in this meta against goats, or like, where do you sit on that?
Sure. So, well, I think the biggest issue with goats, like, I think goats beating traditional dive is fine for me. I don't think that's a problem, right? I think if you pick a whole bunch of tanks, it wouldn't make sense for dive to be able to get in and get those kills in a very tight window of time. You know what I mean? You're not supposed to be able to burst down tanks. I think the issue is that you don't lose to poke either, and poke is the thing that in like the Overwatch rock paper scissors, that's supposed to beat tanks, because the thing that is weak about tanks is their short range. So if you have these long range poke compositions, that should be able to beat it. And in a normal sense, Mercy enables those poke comps, and even with her enabling the Pharah, it's still not enough to overcome Goach right now. So I think in the regular history of Mercy play and the way her hero works right now, she definitely enables DPS more. I think that if you were to give her mass res, though, that enables a tank composition way more than the rest of her kit enables a DPS, basically, because res instantly brings all of those high HP heroes back, and the strength of goats is everyone always being in a ball and fighting on the objective and winning the time game. Because of that, I think she would go from being a DPS enabler to a tank enabler, and I think that it would make it even harder to supplant or remove a tank comp from the point. So essentially it would make them even less susceptible to the best counter, which is a poke comp. So I think that particular rework would actually make things much harder for counter goats comps to remove those tank heavy compositions from those objectives. Like, I can't imagine trying to come up with a strat to push a payload map against a goats comp that can fight me twice. I would just run out of time. It didn't matter if I had a counter comp and I never died. Like, I would just literally run out of time to complete the map, I think.
Okay, I'm excited now because we're finally getting at the heart of the disagreement. Okay, so this is where I come from on the other end of this. I wonder if we remember the few years ago when Mercy actually did have mass res, and when that era actually ended to go into Ana, where we did have triple tank for a long time, actually. Apex Season 1 and just about everything prior to that, there was triple tank. However, Mercy was not played because, well, Ana, you think you would have to argue, was even stronger back then. But one of the main reasons why Mercy wasn't played back then is because her mid-fight is terrible, frankly. And it only looks good because her strongest mid-fight ability, at least in my eyes, is her ability to use vertical escape in order to dodge attacks and have self-peel, where she's able to heal herself as she runs away. If you play Mercy in a tank comp, first of all, I want to know who you think you even can substitute out in order to make that comp not get destroyed by the comps you already use now in order to counter her, and how we think she even can survive long enough to come in for a res. Because in my eyes anyway, if you're running the comp now, which you already use to counter goats as it is, which would be like Winston, Pharmacy, I think, are sort of the core. Winston does too much reliable damage to stop her self-heal from activating, and any other meta where we've had Mercy be the focal target, being so powerful with that res mechanic, you can trade your lives in order to go dive after her, lose some members, and if your Mercy's alive in the sky with the Pharah, well, you have res, they don't, you win every team fight. That's how I see these team fights going. When people say, like, for example, I saw on Twitter, some people say, well, what's to stop the GOATS comp from removing Lucio and putting in Mercy? And I'm like, What? Removing Lucio? How is that even possible? Try removing Lucio from Goats Comp right now and tell me how that works out for you. Even in the mid-fight alone, okay? Even if we assume you could get a res off, Goats Comps gets destroyed if you start to think about removing... You can't remove Brig. I don't think you can remove Lucio either. And if you remove Zen, your poke is terrible. And if you don't have Moira or Ana, I think you get out-poked. Right now, currently, at least on live, she gets 50 heals a second. That is so bad, I think you would easily win with any sort of poke composition, triple DPS, anything. The Mercy comp with Goats would get demolished by damage, in my opinion.
The first thing, which is the hero that's getting swapped out, I think you're 100% on the money. It's the Zen. Cannot do without speed. You cannot do without the Brigitte. So you do swap out the Zen. And I think that, I mean, as far as going against poke comp, except on specific points where you can like group up and play together and like hide in a Moira stack, Goats with Rhine loses to poke comp on maps where you can play poke comp. I don't think Zen, a Moira, and Ana, a Mercy, I don't think it matters. You lose to poke comp there. What the Goats comp has to do to counter is you just swap out the Winston, and then I don't think it matters which support you have, you win that matchup, and I think you win it convincingly. I think that you don't have to worry about poke comps. The only concern is counter Goats. And again, if the only way to counter this is to play your own Goats, I think that it is not good for the meta. I think it ends up enforcing Goats, right? But I think that on defense, I would still rather play the Mercy than the Zen because of the ability to stall for so much time with that res mechanic. I think that that's currently a strategy that teams use on defense of payload maps. That's why you see Goats teams holding super close on payload so they can get 3 fights in the first stage of payload instead of just 2. Like, they know the other team can just swap to a poke comp, to a Pharah Hanzo or a triple DPS because it's the very beginning of the map. They know that that can happen, but they don't care because it takes you so long to kill them anyways that if they just hold their ults for the last fight, they know they're going to win that, and then it's 150-50 fight at the very end. And I think that strategies like that will get more and more prevalent and stronger with the Mercy existing. So on defense specifically, even in the Mercy Zen matchup, I would pick the Mercy. Like, that 5-man res is so good. The sustainability of Goats right now is not good because Zen has a lot of healing. The reason you can afford to run a Zen most of the time in these compositions is because not only does Goats have a lot of HP, right, but you have so many ways to mitigate the damage. So you don't end up taking all the damage. You can really slow down if you cycle your cooldowns correctly and you rotate who's standing in front so your AoE healing can get lots of value. Being able to bring those tank characters back up to full HP and the ability to use their cooldowns for another cycle and keep delaying like that would be just way too strong.
I think you make some pretty good points there, and especially with the ult fight and just stalling, that's definitely a concern. Don't want Goats to get any better, right? Obviously, I don't think either of us want to see that happen, or anybody in the world right now, so it's definitely something that's on the table. I just think the mid-fight of Mercy is being way too overvalued in this conversation, where previous, when she had mass res, it was nearly impossible to play Mercy a lot of the time. In the top-level meta, when mass res was in the game, she hardly ever got used. Now, frankly, there wasn't Goats comp back then, but the fall off you're going to have between the Zen being in your comp with Discord from range and also being one of the most lethal damage characters in the game, in a pro's hands anyway, to having a Mercy who just holds a beam, it's dramatic. It's so much so that you won't kill anything with Goats, whereas right now with Zen in there, you look insane because you don't have to fight anything until you Discord it, then you focus that, put all the cooldowns down into the tank, and you're deadly. That same amount of impact in the mid-fight is just going to vanish if Mercy takes up that slot, and comps like Pharmacy, for example, have no fear whatsoever up in the sky when there's no Discord orb to help the diva focus her out of the air. I also want to say, we're talking about reworking the character. So this idea that all the characters come back with full HP, well, that's negotiable too. We could have a res where they come back at 40% health, 50% health, or you channel it up to have a longer cast time. I think maybe you press Q once or hold it down or whatever in order to ramp up to a higher level of resurrection. Or maybe there's a limit to how much HP you can bring back. It's only 200 or something, for example, which would be terrible for tanks, obviously. In my mind anyway, if the Winston dive comp is chasing after your Mercy, Pharah's no longer contested in the sky with Discord orb to easily focus her out of the air, I think their Mercy almost always dies in these fights, and your Mercy is safe, because you're putting Mercy into a comp in GOATs with no vertical escape whatsoever, playing shoulder to shoulder with everybody, and if you're allowed to sacrifice things to kill what's supposed to be their carry flex healer, which normally would have been a Zen, who does an outrageous amount of mid-fight value, and instead you're killing Mercy in that same fight, you could still res, and they can't. So anytime you can res and they can't, poke comp or dive comp or whatever wins every single time. Route 66, I think, is probably the best example that you brought up, and is kind of a annoying map to watch and play, I think, for many people, because it's all about stalling the payload recently. If you attempt that strategy where you put Goat's Mercy on point in order to hope that on third fight, when it gets to the checkpoint, you're going to come back and res, well, if I have res and you have res, the Mercy comp that is able to kill the Mercy, but keep theirs, always wins. And I think that's always the damage comp, because it has vertical escape. Whether you're playing Widow, Ashe, Pharah, whomever, they're going to look on top, thus making the entire HP points on the payload idea sort of null and void.
Okay, well, I think your point of Zen having more mid-fight value is probably valid in a tank comp. I think the difference between them is much smaller than you, I guess. A lot of times, like the strength in Discord, it's a 30% damage received increase, right? So it goes onto the target. So no matter where damage comes from, it gets amplified when it hits this person. So it's really good in GOATs, because you want the only time you can do damage to someone, usually multiple people on your team can do damage to that person. So the Discord works really well. Whereas Mercy Boost, you're boosting the output of one person instead of the incoming damage from everyone. But the thing is, a very large majority of the time in GOATs, a maximum of 2 people are doing damage anyways. And the most important one is the Zarya. And the reason that Zarya is so important is A, she just has the most damage output when she's charged, but B, there are times where like the Rhine has to put his shield up. He can't be swinging. He's on the front line. He's their main target, so he can't play overly aggressive. There's going to be defense matrix up. Zarya doesn't care about any of that. Zarya just keeps shooting and keeps doing damage. And I think damage boosting a Zarya actually gives you quite a bit of room, especially when you consider she can play even more aggressively with her self bubble, play even more of an off-angle flank carry style, because she knows she has that Mercy pocket. If she gets sped on by the other team, it's going to be even harder to kill her. She'll have her self bubble. There will still be boops to save her from the Diva, the Lucio, the Brig. She has armor pack. I think you can enable hyper carry Zarya players, and they will be able to put out a much higher amount of damage than they do currently. There is a difference in mid-fight value, and that the Zen comp would still do more damage overall than the Mercy comp, but I think that you would still have enough damage to get kills when you build your advantage through your cooldown management. Your argument about Mercy just getting dived on or losing to Pocomp, I just completely disagree there. I would say that Zen is a much more vulnerable hero and a much juicier target for you to go after than a Mercy is, right? Killing a Zen against Goats Comp is so good, and it does so much for you, yet you're not able to do it. You can't just dive and kill a Zen. It doesn't work. You lose to the Goats comp. And that's because there are just too many cooldowns that are available to pocket and protect that Zen. I don't think you can dive and kill the Mercy. She is less vulnerable than Zen. She has movement abilities to dodge things, to get out of the way when people speed onto her. It's very easy for Lucio to just wall ride and give you a path to fly out of danger without even having to go far. You just slingshot yourself. I see no way that she is more of a vulnerable target than Zen, and that strategy does not work to shut down Zenyatta, so I don't know why it would be any more effective against a Mercy.
Well, you're definitely right. She's much easier to escape than Zenyatta. I just think that because you're playing a 3-3 comp, she's at the heart of the battle anyway. It's not like she's guardian angeling to a Pharah in the sky, miles in the distance, where no one in the entire game basically can touch other than maybe like a Widow, which again is kind of the point that I want Mercies to have to fly to the sky to enable the need of having hit scan heroes and DPS heroes, etc. But the issue for me is that I think that you're undervaluing is the ability to actually trade and even down trade in order to go get that carry flex support and then have your own res afterward. We're all used to seeing the current dive meta not work against Goats, that I think we forget how insane it is to bring back your divers after they full commit on to pull out all those cooldowns and kill the Mercy. Anytime where you would do that and then you res, well, you instantly win, no matter what you're resing, even if it's 1 or 2 targets. Right now we're in a state with Goats comp, this also gets into the old ultimate problem as well, where there's 3 healers, so even if you were to dive to kill one, you're not really at an advantage, unless you had res, in my opinion. And they also are building the massive ults that just destroy your front line anyway. Anything that wants to contest the point is going to get mega grabbed, which got buffed like 10 times over the course of the couple years, so no one can escape it basically. And grabbed, earth shattered, all these other abilities that are really deadly, bash as well, although that is getting a nerf coming onto this next patch that's coming out tomorrow. But once you drain all those cooldowns or even get one of those ultimates out, the team that's able to keep their Mercy alive, which I think is always favored to be the mobility team because you simply can get her farther away, you always can overcommit in order to go kill that Mercy. And I suppose in the Goats team. In any case, the damage comp is going to be able to play at further range away from the Goats comp, and your Mercy is almost always going to whatever survival rate we think both Mercies have, the one with the split team, I think, has to be higher than the Goats team, despite all the peel, just by the nature of where she has to play in the fight.
I think that you can play it that way, but I think your effectiveness, if you're talking about pocketing a hit scan like a Widow or Ashe, I think those heroes are useless against Goats comp. There's no reason to pick them. If you want them to be the pocket target, Mercy will not work against Goats basically.
Well, it's not for Goats, it's for Mercy though. It's to kill the Mercy. Because if you kill their Mercy and your Mercy survives, I think you win all the time.
Again, wouldn't that apply to Zen as well? Zen is way easier to headshot. Why isn't Widow and Ashe an option against Goats? You can't get reliable sightlines on the Zenyatta. It won't work.
Because the DPS team right now doesn't have mass res, so they can't overcommit to set up that play. So right now, as you've even said at the start, right, teams are running non-Goats comps to counter Goats comp, just with difficulty doing so, right, with the margins of error being incredibly small.
Right, but none of those include a hit scan. That's what I'm saying. The hit scan doesn't work.
But nobody's running Mercy.
The Pharah,
nobody's running Mercy at Goats. You run Mercy with the counter Goats.
You can argue, but I think Mercy is less vulnerable to a Widow than a Zenyatta is. I think that if your goal is to kill the support first in a tank comp like this, you will not succeed and you will lose really hard. I think they have too many peel options for that to work. You have to go for the targets that are in front of you for a long period of time. There just isn't a way to burst through all of the tank abilities. I think it is an issue of you do have to have sustained damage rather than that burst damage, unless the burst damage is a very, very high amount of burst damage that you get from an ultimate, like a Tire or a Barrage, right? But if it's just a headshot from a Widowmaker, that's not enough, I think.
The Goats comp itself doesn't perform as well against Pharah if it's running its own Mercy, because the reason why oftentimes Pharah struggles, as you're saying, poking down the front line, well, if they have Moira, just way more healing than Pharah probably can damage through. If they have Zen, they'll play more defensive and then frag with the Discord Orb. You won't have either of those two massive mid-fight abilities. Instead, you'll have a Mercy healing 50 damage a second, sometimes damage amping your Zarya, but you'll get almost none of the healing and a very small fraction of the offense that Zen would have had. And I think it would be so bad that you would never want to use it because of that, because you would just be able to poke down the tanks with Pharah against Mercy, because of course your damage amping rockets that deal 156, I believe, and Mercy's healing 50 a second. It's the exchange rate there is so hilariously lopsided that I don't think you would want to run it.
Yeah, I think it's just the abilities that mitigate those rockets from landing that mean that it would be enough healing. I think if you cycle your shields, your bubbles, your defense matrix, you end up getting hit by so few rockets that it would be enough healing.
As you said, we already use Pharah now to counter Goats sometimes. Am I wrong in saying that?
You do when you play it with multiple DPS, but that's to counter a Zen. If they have a Moira, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree. But if they have a Mercy, I think you just win. Of course, we've debated the Zen Mercy vulnerability thing, but you're dropping all your mid-fight with having a Mercy instead of a Zen and hoping you just survive long enough. in my opinion, usually it's in the mid-fight where these Pharah comps or DPS comps look to succeed, and it's really only until the ult fight where the goats are like, oh, we're taking this round back, by the way. Oftentimes what happens, the goats comp jumps on point, gets the objective for free, the Pharah comp pokes them down, gets ults, and eventually floods them off. It's like, okay, great, now we have point control. They gained a little objective, and now we're set up defensively. And there's sort of a dance between the goats comp retaking back into the Pharah, doing everything you're saying, avoiding all the damage, getting back onto point, and it's really only until those ultimates start getting popping that the goats comp starts to look good again in that matchup. And if you have res and either they don't, or their res, in my opinion, does less value overall, you actually can sustain past that. Because the issue is, if your Pharah or your Winston goes down in the anti-goats comp, you basically just lose the fight. Whereas if you have the option to res them after they go for either a risky play or committing to a barrage, then you have those key carry players alive that the goats comp struggles against, and especially after they've used all of these key cooldowns. The windows of time for those cooldowns to see maximum effectiveness, I think it's important for us not to forget that there are those windows where those cooldowns aren't active. So if they dump them to kill someone and you res them for the next 10 seconds or so, you actually are at a much bigger advantage than I think you're giving credit for.
Well, I think your point about those offensive cooldowns being back up would also apply to resing defensively and getting defensive cooldowns as well. So I think that just ends up balancing in the grand scheme of things. But I think that the amount of healing you can do is definitely enough to sustain through the regular poke. The only thing that you have to worry about, even with a Zen in the current meta, is when they build up to those ultimates, when they have something like an EMP barrage combo, right? To try and come, especially on control, where you always have to be touching the point. I think Pharah to counter goats is much better on payload attack, where you don't have to touch the point until you kill everyone, because if someone's touching the point, you can't do anything anyways. So you kill everyone first, then you touch the point. But with control, if you're holding it, you have to constantly keep touching it. And I think that makes it much harder. In those cases on control maps, it's very rare that the Pharah comp can win without ultimates. And I think the Mercy would give you the ability to, they win a fight with ultimates, and then you just undo that, and now they don't have their ultimates, and they have no way to re-kill you. So I think that's the biggest issue, is when it comes to team wiping a goats comp with a Pharah comp, for example. I think the Pharah comp is really reliant on barrage, whereas the goats comp can win with any number of single ultimates invested. And if you hold res for every barrage, I don't think they have an alternate win condition. I think that's the overwhelming issue, is that it's much easier for the tanks to win the fight off of just one ult or just even a support ult, where that wouldn't be the case for the damage options.